Okay, I have no idea why it shut down there, but we will pick up where we left off. We were in the 24th Amendment, and I was getting ready to say that the 24th Amendment has a section 2 that says that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Okay? All right. So, no more poll tax. You don't have to pay for one of the rights of citizenship to vote. All right. The 25th Amendment. And it's probably a good idea that our video stopped when it did, a previous video, because the 25th Amendment takes a while to do. And so it'll all be on the same video. Here we go. 25th Amendment. Remember that many of these amendments are there not because something has happened that they're talking about, but it's to prevent something from happening. It's to close a loophole before the problem pops up. And that's the case for much of the content of the 25th Amendment. Not all, but most. All right, the 25th Amendment was created in 1967. Lyndon Johnson was the President of the United States. Here we go. Section 1. In case of the removal of the President from office, or of his death or resignation, the Vice President shall become President. Now, that is so obvious to us. But guess what? If you read back through the previous parts of the Constitution, never does it say that if the office of the President becomes vacant, the Vice President will become the President. It never says that in those words. It's always been implied, it's always been assumed, but it's never been said in words. Finally, it's in words, right? If the office of the president becomes vacant for whatever the reason, the vice president will become the president. All right, section 2. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both chambers of Congress. Now, before the 25th Amendment, no, let me do it like this. A number of presidents had already died in office, hadn't they? I mean, there's a long list of them. And the vice president had always become the president. But what happened to the office of the vice president under the old Constitution? Well, it's very simple. Nothing. The office of the vice president remained vacant. We had no vice president until the next presidential election took place. And then we would elect a new vice president. Section 2 fixes that problem. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of both chambers of Congress. Okay. So, after the 25th Amendment was ratified, if the office of the vice president was vacated for whatever the reason, a new vice president would be chosen. He would be nominated by the president, and then he would be confirmed by a simple majority vote in the Senate and in the House. This is totally new. By the way, it's a good thing that the 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, because in just a few years it would have to be used. For example, here we go. True story. This is not conjecture. This is not theory. This is the real deal. In 1973, the president was Richard Nixon, and the vice president was a former governor of the state of Maryland by the name of Spiro Agnew. He was Greek. Isn't that a beautiful name? Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was elected vice president. Nobody knew at the time, though, that Spiro Agnew was a crook. He had taken all kinds of bribes and everything when he was the governor of Maryland before he becomes the vice president. And when all of this becomes known, Agnew resigns from the vice presidency. Now, before the 25th Amendment, the vice presidency would not have been filled, would it? It would have remained vacant. But by 1973, the 25th Amendment was in effect. So what happens? President Nixon nominates a fellow by the name of Gerald Ford to be the new vice president. And he is confirmed by a joint session of the Congress, majority vote, right? Just one more than half. And so now we have a vice president again. What happens a short time later? Well, we know. Nixon is accused of masterminding the break-in of the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate scandal, in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And Nixon is eventually forced to resign from the presidency. It's never happened. That's the only time that's ever happened. So we got no president. Who becomes the president? Gerald Ford. Very constitutional, right? But now the office of the vice president is vacant again. Good Lord. So what does President Ford do? He nominates a fellow, former governor of the state of New York, a fellow by the name of Nelson Rockefeller. Yeah, the member of the richer than God Rockefeller family. And he is confirmed by a joint session of Congress as well. And so we have a president and a vice president again. And none of that would have happened had it not been, none of the stuff that happened to the vice presidents would have happened had it not been for the 25th Amendment, which had been ratified in 1967, only 6 or 7 or 8 years prior. Okay, let me read that again. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both chambers of Congress. Now, it doesn't say this, but they can nominate anybody they want as long as they're qualified to be the president, right? Age, citizenship, residency. All right, Section 3. Section 3 is dealing with another what-if scenario. Section 3 says, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office,